What you are about to hear is not a rant, it is not a slogan. The episode is about power, about organization, and about how modern political movements don't appear overnight. They are built deliberately, layer by layer, through coalitions that mix labor ideology, activism, media, and money. In January 2026, Minnesota became the epicenter of one of the most aggressive anti federal enforcement actions in modern American history. A coordinated statewide call to shut down daily life under the banner of ICE out Minnesota. What I want to do in this series is strip away the noise and walk you through who organized this, who backed it, and who amplified it, and how it was funded and supported, and how much of this is documented fact versus ideology narrative. This is one of a part 4 series, and today we start at the foundation, the event itself, the coalition that brought it into existence, and the mechanisms of how a protest becomes a statewide shutdown. When Minnesotans woke up on January 23rd, 2026, they were not witnessing a spontaneous uprising. They were seeing the results of a week long coordinated planning. Public endorsements, internal mobilization, and cross organizational alignment that had been building long before the first business closed its doors or the first merch stepped out. The event, branded the ICE Out of Minnesota, the Day of Truth and Freedom, was explicitly framed as a general strike style action: no work, no school, no shopping, no normal economic activity. That framing matters because a general strike is not simply a protest, it's a political tool designed to demonstrate leverage over economic systems rather than just public opinion. The immediate catalyst cited by organizers was the fatal shooting of Renee Nicole Good during the ICE operations there in Minnesota, an incident that rapidly became a rallying point across activist networks, labor unions, and progressive organizations. Within days, statements of outrage were issued, not just for grassroots groups, but by institutional actors, including union locals and statewide advocacy organizations, signaling that this was moving quickly beyond a single protest into something much larger and more coordinated. What distinguishes the shutdown from the prior demonstrations was formally signed on the public sponsor list, including major labor organizations such as Minnesota AFL CIO, SEIU Local 26, um, Amalgamated Transit Union Local 1005, Communications Workers of America Local 7250, and the Minneapolis Federation of Educators. These are not the fringest groups. These unions collectively represent tens of thousands of workers in transportation, education, healthcare, and janitorial services. Their participation provided not only legitimacy but operational muscle, internal mailing lists, strike-ready infrastructure, legal teams, and established leadership hierarchies capable of mobilizing larger numbers of people quickly. Alongside labor stood an ecosystem of progressive and activist nonprofits, including immigration rights organizations, racial justice coalitions, and faith based advocacy groups, and the national movements with local chapters such as Indivisible, Black Lives Matter, Twin Cities, and Jewish Voices for Peace. These groups provided the narrative framing, casting ICE not as law enforcement agency but as an occupying force, and which helped translate outrage into coordinated action through the rallies, teach-ins, and digital campaigns. But the labor community organizations were only one layer of this coalition. Beneath that layer, and crucial to understanding why critics refer to this as an axis rather than the single movement, were explicitly ideological organizations. The Democratic Socialists of America, both nationally and through its Twin Cities chapter, publicly promoted the shutdown and circulated guidance on how workers would legally participate by using sick leave or collective action protections. The DSA's involvement is documented and participated by using sick leave or collective action protections. It is documented and undisputed. It was openly advertised in their own communications and on the event's promotional materials. Even further left on the ideology spectrum, groups such as the Party for Socialism and Liberation, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, the Revolutionary Communists of America, and the Communist Party USA Twin Cities chapters. They all amplified the shutdown and explicitly framed it as part of a broader revolution or anti-capitalist struggle. These organizations did not hide their intent or worldview. They openly described the Minnesota action as a model of the national resistance against federal authority, capitalism, and they described it as an imperial structure for the United States. This is where the narrative begins to split. Depending on the perspective, supporters argue that this breath proves the shutdown was genuine grassroots uprising reflecting widespread moral outrage. Critics argue that the same breath demonstrates ideological capture. The labor and the community grievances were intentionally fused with revolutionary political objectives that exalted far beyond immigration enforcement. What is not in dispute is that this coalition did not assemble accidentally. The alignment of unions, nonprofits, socialist groups, and activist media requires deliberate coordination and shared messaging and resource sharing. Media amplification played a decisive role. Activists aligned outlets such as Breakthrough News and organizations like the People's Forum provided national level promotion of live stream and narrative framing and pushed the Minnesota shutdown far beyond local news. These platforms consistently framed the action as part of a nationwide struggle against ICE and the United States immigration policy as a whole. Reporting has socialist and communist organizations on messaging and mobilization through the exact financial relationships between each entity vary and are still being examined by congressional investigators. The examination matters because their allegations of external funding networks enter the picture. Congressional oversight committees have issued subpoenas related to Neville Singham, a wealthy businessman who was funding and supported several activist media and organizational platforms connected to this ecosystem. Reporting confirms that Singham-linked organizations amplified the Minnesota shutdown. However, as now, public records have not concisely established direct financial transfers from Singham to the Minnesota organizational bodies themselves. This distraction is critical and it is often lost in partisan commentary. Amplification, coordination, and the ideological alignment are documented with direct funding specific to the Minnesota action, which remains under investigation. On the ground, the shutdown achieved measurable impacts. Hundreds of businesses closed, volatility, transit disruptions occurred, schools reported elevated absences, rallies drew thousands despite severe winter conditions, faith leaders led public vigils, as well as union leaders who gave speeches and organizers framed the day as proof that the collective action could disrupt economic normalcy. At the same time, law enforcement agencies and state officials warned that a full general strike could create safety risks and legal consequences, highlighting tensions between protests, rights, and public orders that would dominate coverage in the days that followed. What Part 1 establishes Minnesota's anti-ICE shutdown was not just a protest. It was an organized demonstration of power built through a multi-layered coalition. Labor provided leverage, activist groups provided moral framing, and ideological organizations provided revolutionary context. The media networks provided amplification, and together they created an event that forced national attention and triggered federal, state, and congressional responses. Whether one views this as a righteous resistance or coordinated radicalism depends largely on political perspective, but the structure itself is real, documented, and deliberate. In Part 2, we're going deeper into the money, legal infrastructure, and the bail funds, nonprofit financing, and the question of how movements sustain themselves beyond a single day of protests. We will separate speculation from documentation, follow the paper trails that actually exist, and examine how modern activism turns disruption into prominence. If you want to understand where this is headed, Part 2 is where the real anatomy of power starts to show. Alrighty, if part one was about who showed up, part two is about how they were able to stay standing. Because mass protests at the scale, especially one that openly challenges federal authority and disrupts economic life, does not survive on passion alone. It requires infrastructure, money, pathways, legal protection, communication platforms, or institutional shields that allow participants to take risk without bearing full permanent costs. This is part of the conversation that trends to emotional because once you talk about money and logistics and the romance of spontaneous uprisings starts to fade, and what remains is organization. The first misconception I want to clear up is the idea that funding always means a single donor writing money directly into protest organizers' bank accounts. That is now the modern political movement's function. Funding today is modular. It moves through nonprofits, fiscal sponsors, legal defense funds, media platforms, and unions and advocacy organizations, each playing a specific role so that no single entity appears to own the movement, even though the ecosystem as a whole is highly coordinated. Let's start with the labor, because labor is the most transparent part of the picture. Major unions backing the Minnesota shutdown did not need to secretly fund anything. They already possesses built-in financial and legal infrastructure, strike funds, legal counsel, communication teams, and memberships dues that can be lawfully used political advocacy. When a union endorses shutdown and encourages participation, it's effective underwriting risk for its members, ensuring legal representation if works face retaliation, and providing guidance on how to participate with the violating labor law. This is not a speculation, this is a standard union practice, and it's one of the reasons union endorsements instantly escalate a protest scale and credibility. Next comes the nonprofit and advocacy layer, which is where substantiality begins to take shape. Many of the organizations involved in the Minnesota action operate a 501c3 or a 501c4 entities, meaning they can accept tax-deductible donations or engage in issue advocacy with endorsing candidates. These groups often act as fiscal sponsors, allowing smaller grassroots projects to raise money using the legal status and accounting systems and donor networks. This structure is legal, common, and intentionally opaque to outsiders who are not familiar with nonprofit finance. Connected to this layer are legal defense and bail funds, which played a critical role during and often after the Minnesota protests. Reporting was confirmed the Minnesota-based defense funds, some partially supported through the public grants and taxpayer-funded programs, were used to post bail for protesters arrested during the anti-ICE demonstrations. This is one of the most controversial elements of the entire episode, because it introduces a feedback loop. Arrests no longer function as a deterrent when participants know the bail and legal costs will be covered in an organized fund. Critics argue this creates a revolving door of protests and arrests with minimal personal consequence. Supporters argue it is necessary protection against what they see as unjust enforcement. What matters here is not whether they agrees with the bail funds philosophically. It understands their strategic role. Bail funds transform protests from a personal gamble into a collective action with pooled risk. The single change dramatically alters how far participants are willing to go. Then there is the media and amplification economy, which is often misunderstood as publicity. Platforms like activist-aligned news outlets, live stream networks, and movement-branded social channels do more than report. They coordinate, signal legitimacy, and attract donors. When a protest is covered sympathetically by ideologically aligned media, donations like link circulated alongside coverage, directing money into nonprofit legal funds and organizing groups that are already part of the ecosystem. This is how funding becomes diffuse, but continues rather than centralized and traceable. This brings us to the most politically charged subject: external donor networks. Congressional investigations have drawn attention to wealthy individuals who fund progressive or left wing media and organizing platforms that in turn promote action like Minnesota Shutdown. The most frequently cited example is Neville Singham, who is a philanthropic and financial support for activist media and organization has been documented through nonprofit filings and investigative reporting that is important, and what often gets distorted is the distinction. Public reporting confirms amplification and ideological alignment, but direct embarked earmarked funding specifically in the Minnesota shutdown remains under investigation and has not been conclusively proven in public record. The distinction matters because modern movements often rely less on direct funding and more on ecosystem support. If a donor funds a media outlet and that outlet mobilizes views, raises money for aligned nonprofits, and legitimizes a protest nationally, the donor influence is real even if no checks is written to protest organizers. Influence today flows through narratives control, not bank transfers as well. No, another overlooked pillar of substantiality is timing or training and institutional memory. Many of the ideological organizations backing the shutdown, including socialist and communist groups, have decades of experience in protest logistics, security culture, legal navigation, and coalition management. They provide training materials, martial de escalation teams, and rapid response communication structures. This expertise lowers the barrier to entry for mass participation and reduces the chaos on the ground. Again, this is not conjecture. These groups openly publish organizational manuals and host training sessions nationwide. What emerges when you put all this together is not chaos, but architecture, a system where labor absorbs workplace risks, nonprofit absorbs financial risk, bail funds absorb legal risk, and media absorbs narrative risk, and ideological organizations provide continuity and long term vision. No single part can be removed without weakening the whole, which is precisely why this model has become so prevalent in modern activism. Supporters of the Minnesota shutdown argue that this architecture is necessary because they are confronting a federal system with vastly superior resources and power. Critics argue that the same architecture enables permanent unrest where disruption becomes a tactic rather than the last resort. Both arguments are rooted in the same reality: the movement is built to last longer than a single day. And that brings us to the uncomfortable question that part 2 raises, but not yet answered. What happens when protest infrastructure outlives the original case or cause that justified it? When organizations, funding streams, and political identities become dependent on continued conflict, the incentive structure changes and resolution becomes less valuable than momentum. That is where we will go in part 3. In part 3, we're going to confront the hardest part of this story: ideology, foreign alignment narratives, and the battle over legitimacy itself, including the claims of foreign influence, information warfare, and why immigration enforcement has become a proxy battlefield for such a larger and political ambitions. This is where facts, fear, and propaganda collide, and where clarity matters most. When you're ready, we'll start it. By the time you reach part 3 of the story, it becomes clear that Minnesota anti-ICE shutdown cannot be understood purely as a reaction to a single enforcement action or even a single death. However tragic, what we are really examining now is a coalition of worldviews, and more importantly, a contest over who gets to define legitimacy in modern American life. Because once movement grows large enough, the fight is no longer just about policy. It's about who is morally authorized to rule, to enforce laws, and to decide what order itself should look like. The ideological organizations backing the Minnesota shutdown are not subtle about the groups like the Party of Socialism and Liberation, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, Revolutionary Communists of America, and the Communist Party USA. Frame the actions not merely as opposition to ICE, but a resistance to what they openly describe as a capitalist imperial state. Their language consistently moved beyond immigration enforcement into broader claims that the United States is structurally illegitimate, that the federal law enforcement factions, as an instrument of oppression and the disruption, not reform, is a necessary path forward. This matters because the ideology shapes goals, and goals determine whether compromise is even possible. At the same time, more mainstream partners, labor unions, faith organizations, and civil rights nonprofits use very different moral vocabulary. Their framing centered on community safety, due process, family separation, worker fear, and constitutional protections. To their supporters, their groups were acting decisively and defensively, responding to what they viewed as unacceptable federal behavior. What made the Minnesota shutdown so powerful and so controversial was these two narratives coexisted in the same coalition, aimed at the same target, if they envisioned radically different endgames. This is where narrative warfare enters the picture, and modern movement legitimacy is not just asserted. It is broadcast, reinforced, and normalized through media ecosystems. Activist line outlets framed ICE as an occupying force and the shutdown of an act of liberation. Opposing media framed the same events as coordinated lawlessness, ideological extremism, or an attempted economic hostage taking, which neither side was neutral, and neutrality itself becomes suspect. Once legitimacy becomes a narrative contest, fact alone, top being decisive, perception becomes power. The dynamic explains why allegations of a foreign influence resonate to us strongly, even when evidence is incomplete and contested. Claims that certain media platforms or activist networks receive funding from donors sympathetic to foreign governments, particularly China, tap into deep national anxieties about sovereignty and information warfare. In the Minnesota case, reporting confirmed that some media and organizing platforms connected to the protest ecosystem have received funding from the donors who openly admire or defend the Chinese Communist Party, the political model. What was not been conclusively proven in public records is that the Minnesota shutdown itself was directly funded or controlled by foreign governments. That distinction is critical. Admiration, ideological alignment, and even donor sympathy is not the same thing as operational control. However, in an era of hybrid warfare, where influence is exerted through narratives, not orders, those distinctions often blur in the public mind. Congressional investigators have focused on whether donor-funded media ecosystem funded function as a soft power instrument shaping American political discourse in ways that align with foreign interests without explicit coordination. This is not unique on the left. It is structural vulnerability that exists across the political spectrum. What makes the Minnesota case notable is how explicitly some actors embrace international framing, messaging compared to ICE to authoritarian police regimes abroad while simultaneously praising models of centralized state power elsewhere. To the critics, it looked like hypocrisy, condemning enforcement at home while excusing repression abroad. To supporters, it was an argument that the American institutions has lost moral authority and could no longer claim exceptionalism. Once again, the conflict was not about immigration policy alone, but about what kind of state America should be. At the ground level, these ideological battles translated into real world consequences. Law enforcement agencies began reassessing crowd control and arrest strategies, knowing the bail funds and legal support reduced deterrence. State officials faced pressure from both sides, some demanding strong resistance to federal enforcement, others demanding restoration and order. Businesses found themselves caught between solidarity, expectations, and economic survival. Ordinary citizens were forced into binary. They did not choose, participate, oppose, or stay silent and be judged anyway. This is a cost legitimacy crisis. When trust in institutions erode, every enforcement action becomes symbolic, and every protest becomes existential, and every compromise is framed as betrayal. In Minnesota, the shutdown exposed just how fragile that trust has become. Federal authority was openly challenged, state authority hesitated, local authority fractured, and it went into a vacuum, step movements willing to define legitimacy on their own terms. Supporters argue that this is what democracy looks like when institutions fail. People organizing outside formal channels to assert a moral truth. Critics argue that this is how democracies destabilize when no authority is recognized except the loudest coalition. Both interpretations exist simultaneously, and that coexistence in and of itself is destabilizing. What Part 3 ultimately reveals that the Minnesota shutdown was not just about stopping ICE, it was about redefining who has the right to enforce the laws whose values matter, and whether disruption itself is a legitimate governing tool. Once those questions are on the table, they do not go away when the protests end. They carry forward. In Part 4, the final chapter, we're going to confront the end game, what this model of protest means for the future and how often it can be deployed, what happens when every side adapts it, and whether a system built on a permanent mobilization can coexist with a functioning civil society. This is where the story stops being about Minnesota and starts being about the country. By the time you reach the final chapter of the story, the truth becomes unavoidable. The Minnesota anti ICE shutdown has never meant to be an endpoint. It was a proof of concept, not simply a protest, not even a general strike of traditional sense, but a live demonstration of how modern political movements can paralyze normal life, force institutional responses, and reshape the boundaries of the authority without ever winning an election, passing a law, and once proof of concept works, it does not stay isolated. The most important question is no longer whether the shutdown succeeds in drawing attention. It did. The question is what happens next. Once disruption itself becomes normalized as a governing tactic rather than an emergency measure. Because a system built of perpetual mobilization does not naturally return to equilibrium, it escalates. The coalition model revealed in the Minnesota is replaceable almost anywhere. Labor provides leverage, nonprofits provide legitimacy, ideological organizations provide continuity, media ecosystems provide amplification, while legal defense funds neutralize risk. None of these elements are illegal on their own. Together, they create a structure capable of sustaining pressure outside of traditional democratic channels. Once assembled, the structure does not simply dissolve when the specific demand is unmet or partially addressed. It waits, it rebrands, and it redeploys. This is where the long term consequences begin to matter. If the federal enforcement can be challenged through economic shutdowns, the incentive structure shifts following every, um, yeah, well, following the dynamic does not favor the moderation, it favors discipline, ideological clarity, and willingness to absorb a social damage in pursuit of leverage. For the supporters in the Minnesota action, this is not a flaw, it is a point. Do you argue that institutional channels are already captured, unresponsive, or morally compromised? From the perspective, disruption is not destabilizing, it is a corrective. Power must be confronted where it is felt, not where it is pretends to listen, and that worldview inconvenience is a small price to pay for justice. But that logic cuts both ways. Once disruption is accepted and legitimate, it cannot be confined to one ideology. Every faction learns from every other faction. The same tool used to shut down commerce over immigration can be used to shut down over elections, court rulings, gun laws, climate policy, or cultural conflicts. Once the line is crossed, it does not move back easily. Minnesota offered a glimpse of what happens to the multi-layers of authority hesitate at once. Federal agencies enforce the law, lost narrative control. State officials challenged federal authority but struggled to maintain order. Local institutions deferred to fractures. In the vacuum, coalitions, not governments, set the tempo of public life. This is not a revolutionary overthrow, but it is a soft displacement of governance where legitimacy is exercised situationally rather than constitutionally. The danger is not chaos alone. The danger is a selective order where rules apply depending on alignment and enforcement, which depends on optics and accountability, which becomes conditional. Over time, citizens internalize this instability. Businesses plan for shutdown, school plan for disruption days, and law enforcement plan for optics rather than deterrence. Political leaders govern defensively, not decisively. And the trust erodes not because people disagree, but because no one believes outcomes are settled anymore. And that may be the most profound legacy of the Minnesota shutdown. It demonstrates a sufficient organized coalition can impose uncertainty on an entire state without seizing formal power. That lesson will not be forgotten by activists, by unions, by politicians, or by the institutions watching from afar. The final irony of this movements built to challenge authority eventually became authorities of their own. They enforce norms, demand compliance, and punish dissent. Socially as not legally. The language changes, the symbols change, but the structure of power remains. History is full of movements that begin by rejecting legitimacy and ended by redefining it in their own image. So the real question is not whether Minnesota was right or wrong. The real question is whether society can survive when every major conflict is treated as existential and every tool is justified because the strikes are always framed as absolute. Because once everything is an emergency, nothing ever truly resolves. The series wasn't about telling you how to think. It was about showing you how power now moves, how protest becomes infrastructure, how ideology merges with logistics, and how legitimacy is contested in real time. Minnesota was not an anomaly, it was a preview. Whether the preview leads to reform, fracture, or something entirely new depends on what the country learns from it and how willing we are to recognize the patterns before they are hardened into performance. Thanks for watching another episode of the Political Lens Podcast. If this breakdown helps you see the bigger picture, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Your engagement keeps these conversations alive and grounded in reality. Peace.